By the early 1470s, a new altar was erected in the Abbey Church of Saint-Honoré in Tuisson, in the province of Picardy. It was situated in northeastern France. Picardy, as well as the neighboring Dutch counties and towns, were in possession of the Dukes of Burgundy. Thus the French and the Dutch artists worked hand in hand and learned from each other. Being skillful in the medieval techniques of stained glass window and miniatures, book illumination, the French learned to paint the altarpieces in the oil technique of the Dutch masters. Thus the future easel painting was born in France. After many centuries, the panels of the Tuisson altar were separated from each other and finally found themselves in different museums, one in the Art Institute in Chicago, and the other, with the gospel scene of the entry into Jerusalem, in the Hermitage. In the latter painting, the gospel event was represented as if it took place in the surroundings of the late medieval town, with its Gothic steeples and spires. The crowd of people greets Christ in the manner as not long before, in 1428-1429, it greeted King Charles VII and the Maid of Orleans, Joan of Arc, who is depicted sitting on a horse and carrying a flying banner. The lithe bodies and flying clothes of the relief Venus and Cupido, executed by Jean Goujon, evoke a parallel with uneasy movements of the elongated figures in the works of the Italian mannerism. This trend was planted in France when King François I, in 1528, ordered the reconstruction of the old castle of Fontainebleau under the surveillance of the Italian masters who became teachers for the local artists. That collaboration inspired a new art, a new Renaissance style, which was called Style of the School of Fontainebleau, although it became the main trend of the French art of the period. The sculptor Jean Goujon did not work in Fontainebleau. He was known in Paris, and the facade of a new royal residence, the Louvre, was adorned with reliefs and statues from his hand. A court without ladies looks like a garden without flowers, King François I used to repeat. Now we can see one of them, dressed in a court dress with sumptuous sleeves and narrow golden-brown waist, a pretty, youthful person with both restrained and lively facial expression, painted by the portrait painter Corneille de Lyon. In the first half of the 16th century, portraiture in France was under the influence of the famous masters Clouet. Jean Clouet, a court portrait painter under François I, and his son François, who succeeded him as painter to the king in 1540, and portrayed kings Henry II and Charles IX. Both masters inspired a new genre of pencil portraiture, which was practiced on a large scale only in France, and was so consonant with French taste that soon after a pencil portrait was more desirable than an oil portrait. Clouet's portrait of Charles IX, young King of France, represents an elegant appearance and a noble restraint, but on the other hand, displays a guarded look and hidden anxiety. Joy is absent in the facial expression of the king, and one can feel skepticism in the hardly noticeable grin on his lips.
The figures of Venus, who was born of the sea foam, as well as of her son Cupid and a dolphin, which is represented here as a symbol of freedom and happiness, are included in an elegant little oval, while the relief is composed in the rhythm of a running wave. This marble work is attributed to one of the famous masters of the French Renaissance, Jean Goujon, who lived from about 1510 to about 1566. The portrait of Étienne du Montstier, painted by his younger brother Pierre, offers a memorable icon of a thinking man of that time. Working at the court under the Valois dynasty, Étienne du Montstier had to be the witness of the acute political battles in France during the destructive religious wars of the last third of the 16th century. This drawing could be a starting point for an oil portrait that is now in the Museum of Art and History in Vienna. The perceptible tension of the sitter's inner life, seen in his restrained facial expression, decisively distinguishes the Hermitage drawing from the Vienna picture, which represents a ceremonial portrait of the King of France. It's not only the emphatically noble posture of the court lady which distinguishes this portrait painted by a renowned master of the French Renaissance. We can value the dignity and evidently strong will of this unknown lady, as well as the beauty of youth, which is imbued here with deep emotion and noble aristocratic moderation. The Bible story represented on this dish tells of how two old men were watching Susanna, the wife of a rich man, while she was bathing. When caught after the woman's cry, they slandered Susanna in order not to be punished, saying that they found her with a lover. The woman was sentenced to death, but was saved by a youth who revealed the deception. This small portable altar came out of the workshop of the famous enamel master of Limoges, who was endowed with a particular sense of color and decorative smartness. The scenes of the Passion of Christ are imbued here with acute medieval spirituality, strengthened by subtle intensity of color. The meeting of Christ by the people near the city walls of Jerusalem was depicted by this artist of the early Renaissance in France, with a keenness of observation which he could only have acquired from the painters of the Netherlands. This faithfulness was combined, nevertheless, with a typically elegant French idealization. The oval faience dish covered with a glaze of dark blue, which was invented by Palissy himself, appears here as a blue pond with fishes and crawfishes at the margin, and with an island in the center, inhabited with frogs and snakes. It is a joyful image of nature itself, with its fertile abundance and perennial generosity. This portrait of an aged man in a high black hat offers an austere but most accurate and substantial characterization, beyond a very good rendering of individual likeness, seen in such features as the sharpened cheeks, thin lips, fleshy nose, and attentive eyes. Bouquet, who ranks as the first Renaissance painter in France, created a convincing image of inherent restrained dignity and inner nobility. The mode of execution of these ornaments by means of different sorts of color clay is still unknown. The earthenware from Saint-Pourchaire, with its elegant white glazed surfaces, ranks as a high example of the subtle taste of French Renaissance culture. This medieval allegory was meant to caution young people against the errors of youth and to call them to search for righteous ways through the world's temptations. The moral contentus practically resolved into a refined floral beauty created by the skillful French weavers of that time.
Such artists of the first half of the 17th century as Wesytern, Callot, and brothers Lenain took their subject matter, characters, and poetic imagery from actual life. They were capable of finding in that reality lofty beauty and poetical essence. They worked at the same time and were not connected to each other, but together they were called the painters of reality. In the etching by Jacques Callot, Le Grand Chasse, human figures are practically absorbed by the infinite space, where it seems difficult to find a definite person. The artist took up the cosmic point of view when lowering the horizon and inviting one to look at this panorama of worldly life from any altitude. Every figure is clearly distinguished, even in the distance, and each gesture and pose are handled with purely French precision and grace that calls to mind the art of the Florentine artists of mannerism. Valentin de Boulogne carried out the pictorial tradition of the great innovator of European art, Caravaggio. The personages of his paintings are taken from the streets and places of Rome, but their manner is restrained and ennobled with a particular dignity. In his painting, The Purification of the Temple, Valentin de Boulogne created the impressive image of a noble, severe, and magnificent hero, seized with a lofty anger. Dramatic treatment is strengthened by the light flashes which penetrate the semi-obscurity when bathing faces, hands, a still body, and the figure of Christ, who chases moneylenders from the temple. Louis XIV, on the contrary, has no need to look for an ideal hero in order to manifest beauty and dignity of a man. The artist reveals natural nobility in a man who performs his worldly duty with modesty and self-awareness. So the peasants are treated in his painting, The Milkwoman's Family. They have tired faces and shabby clothes, but this immobile and closely joined group is endowed with monumentalism and exquisite color richness, while emanating the same calm lyricism as one can feel by seeing these silver blue hills under the soft sun of northern France. The style of Nicolas Poussin, evolved by the early 1630s, was called Classicism. The art of ancient Rome was the model and source of his inspiration, but he ingeniously remade the principles of Italian academicism and Baroque. It was not thus accidental that the most suitable surround for his aspirations Poussin found in eternal Rome, where he created during the 1630s such paintings as Tancred and Herminia and The Descent from the Cross. Poussin liked to repeat, "Subject is the beginning of the painting, and the subject must be noble." Just so the artist treated Herminia's great-hearted deed. She cut off her hair, which was endowed with magic force, in order to heal the wounds of the knight Tancred, who fought with the giant Arganthus as embodiment of evil. The personages chosen by Poussin distinguish themselves with noble beauty, as if they were the ancient gods, and their movements and poses are precise expressions of appropriate meaning. The dynamic pose of Herminia embodies love. The armor-bearer Warfin expresses true devotion, and the image of Tancred is endowed with an aura of chivalrous selflessness. The subject of the painting, The Descent from the Cross, was handled by its author as a dramatic scene penetrated with the glow of color. The mother's grief and John's lively compassion contrast with the restrained treatment of the dead body of Christ, whose noble sacrifice was destined for the people's salvation. Poussin's fame was great enough to reach Paris. In 1640, he was persuaded to return to Paris to work for the king and Cardinal Richelieu. In spite of his extraordinary position among other artists who worked for the crown, in 1642 he made an excuse to return to Rome, which he never again left. The superficial decorativeness of French court art was unbearable for him. In his last period, Nicolas Poussin painted mainly landscapes. He continued to believe in lofty beauty, but found it only in nature. Human beings, feeble and imperfect, were able to adopt beauty only through their contact with nature. One can feel this mood of disappointment in the painting Landscape with Polyphemes. Its personage, the one-eyed Cyclops Polyphemes, whose love was rejected by the beautiful nymph Galate, mounted a hill to seclude himself and to unburden his heart with the plaintive sounds of the flute. Artistic principles of classicism, created by Poussin in Italy, returned to France to become the dominant style of French art in the second half of the 17th century. Poussin's motto, beauty and majesty, that meant loftiness of the eternal truths, was modified as beauty of majesty and subordinated to the only idea, to declare the majesty of French monarchy and the monarch himself, Le Roi du Soleil, Louis XIV. The bronze equestrian statue of Louis XIV, executed by François Girardon, evokes a parallel with a great antique bronze equestrian monument representing the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and still standing on Capitolium in Rome. The model of the French statue, which stood till the Revolution on the Place Vendôme in Paris, is in the Hermitage collection. Louis XIV was represented especially often by Nicolas de Largière in his painting Meeting of Parisian Magistracy, dealing with the matter of the erection place for the statue of Louis XIV. Sketch in the Hermitage. We see the French king several times as a living person sitting at the head of the feast dinner table, and as two different sculptural effigies in the bronze half-length portrait and in the model of an equestrian statue, while its author modestly stands nearby in the corner. The artist represented and eternalized such ordinary events as the visit of His Majesty to the City Council, which took place on 30 January 1687. Here were brought together Baroque sumptuosity as classicist exactness and clear order. This conjunction was characteristic of the French court art under Louis XIV, as a major feature of the so-called grand manner, which was evolved in order both to praise the king and to adorn the public halls and palace rooms.
The painter represented Christ as a severe and magnificent hero seized by a noble anger. According to the usual dramatic treatment of this subject, flashes of light penetrate the semi-obscurity and catch the faces, hands, a body, and Christ himself, who is chasing the moneylenders from the temple. The motif of the encounter between spiritual and fleshly forces acting in the world imparts a heightened symbolic meaning to this stormy picture. This splendid piece of furniture was made after a sketch that is kept now in the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris. Master Boulle, the first royal cabinet maker, executed not only the sketch, but also all bronze details, including their gilding, and applied with his own hand the complicated patterns of tortoise plates, wood and brass, on the wardrobe's doors. Later, this ingenious technique was given his name and became widespread as the Boulle technique. This huge canvas offers an ideal image of the Queen, represented with the usual attributes of Minerva, an owl, and a helmet. This picture had to proclaim the idea of the divinity of royal power, in addition to its direct purpose of adorning a palace room. This temperamental pencil drawing bears a date 26 June 1640, written by the painter himself in the upper corner of the sheet. The drawing is penetrated by remarkable feeling of life. The appearance of a young French aristocrat is imbued with unconquerable energy of thought and emotions. This is an author's model of the monument that stood on the Place du Vendôme in Paris until it was demolished during the Revolution. The model was molded of bronze, as was the statue itself, in the workshop of the brothers Keller. The unknown man painted by Jouvenet in this portrait was treated just as a private person, and no longer as an embodiment of the abstract idea of nobility and majesty. Particular subtlety of execution distinguishes this etching, which is, in fact, a masterpiece of Jacques Collot. He created here a panoramic depiction of a hunting scene, which was undoubtedly a reflection of his own impressions during his stay at the courts of the Dukes of Florence and Lotharingia, where he worked. In the appearance of the subject, such unattractive features of advanced age as sharp wrinkles and a sunken mouth are sharply accentuated, but the monumental representation ennobles this figure. An awareness of the inherent inner power and wisdom that seem to penetrate this person imparts a majesty to his image. This is a preliminary sketch for a picture by Langier. It hung on the wall in one of the town hall's rooms until 1793, when it was destroyed by fire. The austere, almost rigid order that dominates in the pictures of Louis XIV spreads also over his color palette. It seems that this 17th century painter proclaimed reason as the source of beauty and harmony in the world. The feeling of implemented duty and the monumental treatment ennoble the figures of peasants by this painter. Being so high in the sky, the sun spreads its bright and regular light over the earth below, where one can discern the hurrying river, the peaceful dells in the distance, the figures of Mary, Jacob, and the child resting on their way to Egypt. Claude's classical manner affirms the immutability of the order that determines the beauty of nature, the peace and harmony of the world. The sky in the distance is merely tinted by a sunrise, barely seen over the horizon, while the coolness of morning still dominates around the well where Jacob met Rebekah for the first time. This is the morning of their love, in conformity with this poetical motif taken from the Bible. A subtle tonal harmony softens the majestic forms of the classical landscape of Claude. The omnipotent minister under Louis XIV was of humble origin. The small features of his cold face betray this rather evidently. This ceremonial portrait offers a splendid treatment, with an immense wig and a sumptuous though austere court costume adorned with a star. But the painter's attitude toward this courtier, although precise, remains obviously indifferent, if not dry. This painter was one of the well-known still-life masters of the 17th century. Having studied in the Antwerp School of Painting, he could impart his motifs, flowers, or fruits with a really Flemish juiciness and freshness, while French subtlety and elegance always acted as strong moderating factors of his style. All landscape details by Poussin are subdued to a well-balanced compositional order supported by a powerful, magnificent rhythm. Mountains, heavens, rivers, as well as hills and dells, inhabited by figures of light-hearted nymphs and peaceful ploughmen, are imbued with a perennial beauty and harmony that conforms to the laws of nature and the universe. High dramatic force and lofty beauty determine the imagery of this scene with the dead body of Christ. The sufferings of Mary and the living compassion of St. John the Evangelist for the dead Christ are emotionally strengthened by the emphasis of glowing colors. This is how the painter treated Herminia's generous deeds. She cut off her hair, which was endowed with magic power, in order to heal the wounds of the knight Tancred, who fought with the giant Arganthus, the embodiment of evil.